Dublin, Ireland, March 17, 2013, 11:47 p.m. The silence in Cillian Murphy's Monkstown home was broken only by the sound of Irish rain battering against the 18th-century Georgian windows. He sat in his downstairs study, a room that breathed cinema, with shelves lined with annotated scripts, framed posters from his independent films, and an oak desk where dozens of characters had been born. But that night, only one character mattered, and Cillian was convinced he couldn't bring him to life. The Peaky Blinders script lay open on page 23. Red markings covered every inch, desperate attempts to find Thomas Shelby in Stephen Knight's words. Beside it, a cup of Irish tea had been cooling for hours, untouched. Cillian ran his hands through his dark hair and sighed deeply. At 37, he had built a respectable career in art films. 28 days later, The Wind That Shakes the Barley, Sunshine, work that the Guardian critic had described as intense and introspective. But Thomas Shelby was an entirely different category of intensity. My God, he murmured to himself, rereading the character description for the 10th time that night. World War I veteran, gang leader, ruthless strategist. He shook his head. I drive a hybrid Prius and apologize when someone bumps into me on the street. It was the third week since the script had arrived by express mail from the BBC. 3 weeks of insomnia, tense conversations with Sarah, staring at mirrors trying to find a Birmingham gangster inside an Irish independent film actor. The phone rang. It was almost midnight. Cillian? It's Stephen. Stephen Knight's voice sounded tired. I know it's late, but we need to talk. Cillian felt his stomach sink. Of course, Stephen. About what? The BBC is pushing for an answer. They have other names on the list. Tom Hiddleston is interested. Michael Fassbender, too. I know you need time, but I understand. Cillian closed his eyes. Stephen, can I ask you an honest question? Sure. Why me? Why didn't you go after Fassbender from the start? He has the physical presence, the experience with intense characters. There was a long pause. Cillian, how many times have you watched The Godfather? The question caught him off guard. About 20 times, maybe more. Why? Marlon Brando was also seen as a strange choice for Don Corleone. Too temperamental, too problematic, too old. But Francis Coppola saw something others didn't. I see the same thing in you for Thomas Shelby. What exactly? The ability to be dangerous without seeming obvious. To command a scene by whispering instead of shouting. Thomas Shelby isn't a brute, Cillian. He's a strategist who learned to be violent. And that, my friend, is closer to you than you imagine. After hanging up, Cillian stared at the script. Stephen was right about one thing. He knew The Godfather by heart. He had grown up watching Brando transform Don Corleone from a character on paper into a cinematic legend. But knowing and being able to replicate were completely different things. He opened the desk drawer and pulled out a faded photo, himself at 8 years old with his paternal grandfather, Patrick Murphy, a man who had served in World War II and never spoke about it. Patrick had a look that Cillian only understood years later, the controlled intensity of someone who had seen too much and learned to keep the ghosts to himself. At least you had a real war, Grandpa, Cillian whispered to the photo. How am I supposed to play a veteran when my biggest battle was deciding between Trinity College and the Royal Academy of Dramatic Art? That's when the temperature in the room changed. It wasn't gradual. It was instant, as if someone had opened a door to winter. Cillian looked up and froze. Sitting in the leather armchair across from his desk was Marlon Brando. Not the elderly, heavy Brando from his later films, but Don Corleone. Dark hair slicked back, sculpted face, immaculate three-piece suit. Those eyes that had hypnotized generations of film lovers, were fixed on Cillian with a mixture of amusement and impatience. Are you going to sit there staring at me all night, kid, or are you going to offer me a drink? The voice was unmistakable, deep, controlled, loaded with natural authority. Cillian blinked several times, convinced he was having a nervous breakdown. You died. In 2004. I read about it in the Times. Brando gave a slow, almost feline smile. I died, yes. But some characters are more enduring than the actors who created them. He leaned forward. Don Corleone didn't die with me, kid. He lives on in every actor who needs to learn how to be a boss. This is impossible. I must be having a breakdown. Sarah always said I worked too much, that one day my brain would... Your brain is working perfectly. Brando interrupted with that casual authority that made Don Corleone unforgettable. In fact, I can say it's working better than usual. Extreme tension has that effect. It sharpens perception. Cillian took a deep breath, deciding that if he was going insane, at least it would be interesting insanity. All right, let's say you're real. Why are you here? I heard you're afraid to play a gangster. Brando leaned back in his chair, studying Cillian like a predator evaluating prey. And I heard you're considering turning down the role because you think you don't have what it takes. That's true. Pathetic. The word came out so naturally that Cillian almost didn't register the insult. Almost. Excuse me? Pathetic, Brando repeated, now with a sardonic smile. An actor with your talent, cowering because he has to play someone braver than he is. You know what your problem is, Murphy? Cillian shook his head, still processing the fact that he was being insulted by Marlon Brando's ghost. You think Thomas Shelby was born brave? That he woke up one day and decided to be a gang leader? Bullshit. Brando stood up and began walking around the room, examining the posters on the wall. Courage isn't a birth trait, kid. It's a decision you make every day. He stopped in front of the wind that shakes the barley poster. Good film. I saw you played an IRA member. Interesting. Brando turned to Cillian. How did you prepare for that role? I researched the historical period, worked on the accent with a coach. No? Brando interrupted impatiently. How did you find the terrorist inside you? Because don't tell me you simply acted. That doesn't work with real characters. Cillian thought for a moment. I remembered how I felt when I saw my brother being bullied at school. The anger, the desire to do anything to protect him. I amplified that feeling. Exactly. Brando clapped once, a sharp sound that echoed through the room. You found the emotional truth first, then built the character around it. So why are you so afraid of Thomas Shelby? Because Thomas Shelby is different. He's bigger, more complex, a protagonist who will carry 6 seasons of television. If I mess up, you will mess up. Brando said this so naturally that Cillian was shocked. Many times. You think I got Don Corleone right on the first try? I spent the first 2 weeks of filming trying to figure out who the hell that man was. Really? Really. Francis almost fired me 3 times. I was trying to play Vito Corleone like a typical Italian, gesticulating, talking loud, being obviously intimidating. A walking cliché. Brando sat back down. It was only when I stopped trying to look like a mob boss that I started to be one. Cillian leaned forward. What do you mean? Watch a cat hunting, Murphy. It doesn't growl, doesn't show off, doesn't announce its intentions. It just exists. Every muscle relaxed, but ready to explode into lethal movement. When it finally moves, the world stops to watch. Brando smiled. Don Corleone was a big cat. He saved even his blinks. And Thomas Shelby? Ah, Thomas is different. He's not a cat. He's a wounded wolf. He came back from the war with trauma, but still needs to lead the pack. He has the wolf's ferocity, but also the vulnerability of someone who's seen too much and learned to keep the ghosts to himself. The difference is that while Don Corleone hid his violence behind courtesy, Thomas uses courtesy to hide his pain. For the first time in 3 weeks, Cillian felt a spark of understanding. So Thomas isn't about intimidation. It's about control. Control of pain, control of fear, control of the people around him. He uses violence as a tool, not as an outlet. Brando leaned forward. You know why Stephen Knight chose you and not Fassbender or Hiddleston? Why? Because they naturally look dangerous. You don't, and that's your advantage. Brando smiled maliciously. When Fassbender enters a room, people expect him to be intimidating. When you enter, they expect you to be gentle. Imagine the impact when they discover they're wrong. Cillian had never thought of it that way. But how do I build that presence? First, stop trying. Presence doesn't come from effort. It comes from restraint. Brando stood up again. Show me how you would walk if you were Thomas Shelby. Cillian stood up, hesitant. He straightened his shoulders, hardened his expression, and began walking around the room with what he thought was authority. Brando shook his head in disgust. Terrible. You're playing an actor playing a gangster. Stop that. So how? Walk like every step is yours by right. Thomas Shelby doesn't invade spaces, he reclaims them. He doesn't look at people, he evaluates them. Every person is either a potential threat or a useful tool. But, and this is crucial, he doesn't need to show it. He simply knows. Cillian tried again, This time thinking less about looking dangerous and more about belonging, about having the right to that space. Better, but you're still thinking too much. Let me teach you a test I use for any powerful character. Brando stopped in front of Cillian. Enter a room full of people and don't say anything. Just observe. If people start feeling uncomfortable, if they start whispering about who you are, then you've found the character. True power doesn't need to announce itself, Cillian murmured, more to himself. Exactly. Don Corleone whispered because powerful men don't need to shout to be heard. When you speak softly, people lean in to listen. When you shout, they pull away. Brando returned to his chair. Thomas Shelby is different. He has controlled explosions. But the explosion only works if there's restraint the rest of the time. Cillian sat down again, feeling for the first time that maybe he could find Thomas Shelby within himself. But what about the accent, the physicality? I look more like a university professor than a Birmingham gangster. Brando laughed, a low, genuinely amused sound. Murphy, do you think I was born speaking like Don Corleone? I had to invent that voice completely. I put cotton in my mouth, changed my posture, created a man who never existed. What do you mean? Don Corleone is a fantasy, kid. A careful construction based on fragments of men I knew, memories of my Sicilian grandfather, even the way my cat moved around the house. Brando leaned forward. The secret isn't finding the character. It's creating him from scratch and then believing in him completely. So, Thomas Shelby needs to be invented by you. Stephen Knight gave you the structure, but you need to give him the soul. Brando became serious. And here's what nobody told you about playing an iconic character. You can't be afraid of him. You have to love him, even if he's terrible. How do I love someone like Thomas Shelby? By finding his humanity. Thomas protects his family above all. He carries guilt from the war. He wants to elevate the Shelbys above their humble origins. These aren't the instincts of a psychopath. They're of a man who makes extreme choices in extreme circumstances. Brando stood up and went to the window, looking at Dublin's rain. You know what my biggest discovery was playing Don Corleone? That he didn't see himself as a criminal. He saw himself as a patriarch protecting his family from a cruel world. Thomas Shelby is the same. He doesn't see himself as a gangster, but as a soldier who returned from war to find Birmingham dominated by enemies. So he's in permanent war. Exactly. And soldiers at war don't have the luxury of doubting themselves. They make decisions and live with the consequences. Brando turned to Cillian. You want to know why you're so afraid of this role? Cillian nodded. Because deep down you know that Thomas Shelby is going to change you. Characters like this always do. After 6 seasons living inside Thomas Shelby's head, you won't be the same Cillian Murphy who was sitting here tonight. The observation hit Cillian like a punch to the stomach. That was exactly it. The fear that Thomas Shelby would be too powerful, too seductive, and that after years playing him, he would lose part of himself. What if I can't come back? What if Thomas Shelby is stronger than me? Brando gave that slow smile again. Then you'll have to be stronger than him. You'll have to create boundaries. Remember who Cillian Murphy is when the cameras stop rolling. You'll have to... He stopped talking and looked directly into Cillian's eyes. Or you can turn down the role, go make your James Joyce film, and spend the rest of your life wondering, what if? Silence stretched between them. Outside, the rain continued beating against the windows. Cillian could hear the room's clock marking the seconds. Can I tell you a secret? Brando finally said. Sure. When Francis offered me Don Corleone, my first instinct was to refuse. I was tired of Hollywood, disillusioned with the industry. I wanted to retire and raise my children in peace. What changed your mind? My ex-wife. She told me something I never forgot. Marlon, are you afraid of failing or afraid of succeeding too much? That's when I realized I was afraid of creating something that would last longer than me, something that would define my legacy. Brando stood up and walked to Cillian's desk, placing his hand on the Peaky Blinders script. Thomas Shelby could be that for you, Murphy. He could be the character that defines you as an actor. The question is, do you have enough courage to let that happen? Cillian looked at the script, then at Brando. What if I accept and fail? What if I can't carry the series? Then you'll have tried. An honest attempt is never failure, it's learning. Brando smiled. But let me tell you something about failure, kid. I failed in dozens of films. Some were forgotten weeks after release, but nobody remembers them. Everyone remembers Don Corleone. Because it was a success. No, because it was true. Because I stopped trying to impress people and started honoring the character. Brando leaned over the desk. Stephen Knight doesn't need Cillian Murphy trying to be Thomas Shelby. He needs Thomas Shelby being played by Cillian Murphy. There's a difference. What's the difference? In the first case, you're worried about your performance. In the second, you're worried about the character's truth. And truth, Murphy, always wins. Cillian closed his eyes and breathed deeply. When he opened them, he felt something different. Not exactly courage, but a kind of surrender. Surrender to the inevitable. Will you teach me? The specific techniques, the practical details? Brando smiled with satisfaction. Now we're getting somewhere. But first, I need you to understand 3 layers of Thomas Shelby. 3 layers. Every complex character has 3 faces. The one he shows the world, the one he shows intimates, and the one he shows only to himself. Don Corleone had these 3 faces. Thomas Shelby too. Brando began walking around the room again, hands clasped behind his back. First layer, public Thomas Shelby, the Peaky Blinders boss, ruthless, calculating, intimidating. This is the persona he uses to control Birmingham. It's theatrical because it needs to be seen to be effective. Second layer, private Thomas Shelby. What he shows his family, his inner circle, still controlled but with glimpses of vulnerability. The war trauma, the protective instincts, the genuine love for his people. Third layer, internal Thomas Shelby. What he shows only in mirrors, in moments alone. The broken soldier, the frightened boy, the man who makes terrible decisions because he sees no alternatives. Brando stopped in front of Cillian. Most actors only play 1 layer. Good actors play 2. Great actors make all 3 visible simultaneously, even when the character is trying to hide them. How do I do that? Practice the contradiction. Thomas is simultaneously the most dangerous man in Birmingham and the most vulnerable. He's absolutely confident in his decisions and absolutely terrified of their consequences. He loves his family so much that he's willing to become a monster to protect them. That sounds impossible to balance. It's not impossible. It's human. Brando sat back down. Every person carries contradictions, Murphy. Thomas Shelby just carries bigger ones. Your job isn't to resolve them. It's to make them believable. They worked until dawn. Brando walked Cillian through exercises in controlled intensity, taught him how to use silence as a weapon, showed him how to make every gesture economical but loaded with meaning. Remember, Brando said as the first light of morning began filtering through the windows, Thomas Shelby doesn't waste energy on unnecessary movements or words. Every action serves a purpose. Even his breathing is calculated. What about the Birmingham accent? That's technique. You'll work with dialect coaches, but the accent is just the surface. Underneath, you need to find the rhythm of a man who learned to speak carefully because words have consequences in his world. As the sun rose over Dublin, Cillian felt something he hadn't experienced in weeks. Excitement. Not confidence exactly, but anticipation. The fear was still there, but it had transformed from paralyzing terror into focused energy. I think I can do this, he said quietly. Of course you can do this. Brando stood up, straightening his suit. The question was never whether you could do it. The question was whether you'd be brave enough to try. Will I see you again? Brando smiled that enigmatic smile. You'll see me every time you need to remember that courage isn't the absence of fear. It's doing what needs to be done despite the fear. As he began to fade, becoming transparent in the morning light, Brando added, And Murphy, when you're doubting yourself during filming, remember this. Every great performance begins with an actor who doesn't believe he can do it. The doubt is part of the process, not the enemy of it. When Cillian blinked, Brando was gone. But the lesson remained carved into his memory like words in stone. The call to Stephen Knight was brief. Stephen, it's Cillian. I'll do it. I'll be Thomas Shelby. What changed your mind? Cillian looked at his reflection in his study window, seeing not just himself but all the characters he could become. I realized that fear is just another form of preparation, and I'm finally ready to be afraid in front of cameras. The rest, as they say, is television history, but not the history most people know. What audiences never saw was the 3 months of intense preparation that followed. Cillian lost 20 pounds, learned to move like a man who had seen combat, worked with military consultants to understand PTSD in WWI veterans, but more important than the physical transformation was the psychological one. Using Brando's techniques, Cillian created a daily ritual. Every morning before filming, he would spend 30 minutes in complete silence, accessing each of Thomas Shelby's 3 layers. Layer 1, he would whisper to himself, Public Thomas, the performance of power. Layer 2, Private Thomas, the burden of leadership. Layer 3, Internal Thomas, the cost of survival. By the time cameras rolled on the first episode, Cillian Murphy had disappeared so completely into Thomas Shelby that even the crew was intimidated. Director Otto Bathurst later said, "I don't know what happened to Cillian during preparation, but when he walked on set that first day, he wasn't Cillian anymore. He was Thomas. It was almost unsettling." But success brought its own challenges. By the end of the first season, Cillian began experiencing what he would later describe as character bleed. Thomas Shelby's intensity, his controlled anger, his suspicious nature began affecting Cillian's real life. Sarah noticed it first. "You're different," she told him after a particularly tense family dinner. "Even when you're not filming, there's something of Thomas in your eyes." Cillian realized Brando had been right. Playing Thomas Shelby was changing him. The question was whether he could control the change or if it would control him. That night, alone in his study once again, Cillian found himself hoping for another supernatural visit. He needed guidance on how to live with Thomas Shelby without becoming him. But this time it wasn't Brando who appeared. It was his grandfather, Patrick Murphy, not as the old man Cillian remembered, but as the young soldier who had returned from Wubby II, carrying his own invisible wounds. "Struggling with the ghosts, are you, lad?" Patrick's voice carried the soft Cork accent Cillian remembered from childhood. "Grandpa? But you died when I was 12. I did, but some lessons take longer to teach than one lifetime allows." Patrick sat in the chair Brando had occupied months before. "I've been watching you become this Thomas Shelby fellow. Reminds me of myself, coming back from the war. How did you handle it? The memories, the changes?" Patrick was quiet for a long moment. "The war taught me to be hard, Cillian. Harder than any man should be. When I came home, your grandmother Sarah, different Sarah than yours, but just as wise, she helped me remember who I was before the uniform." "How?" "She made me tell stories, not about the war, but about who I wanted to be after it. Every night she'd ask me to describe one thing I wanted to do that had nothing to do with being a soldier." Patrick smiled. "Took me 2 years to remember I wanted to teach children to read." "And did you?" "I volunteered at the local school for 30 years. Never told anyone why, but those children, they reminded me that I was more than what the war made me." Cillian understood. "So, I need to remember who I am, besides Thomas Shelby." "Not just remember, lad. Practice. Every day do something that Thomas Shelby would never do. Something gentle, something vulnerable, something purely Cillian Murphy." It was advice that would save not just Cillian's sanity, but his marriage and his soul. From that night forward, Cillian developed what he privately called the reverse method. For every hour he spent as Thomas Shelby, he would spend 30 minutes being deliberately consciously himself. He took up watercolor painting, something Thomas would find frivolous. He volunteered at a local literacy program, something Thomas would see as weakness. He learned to play the tin whistle, something that connected him to Irish culture in a way Thomas never could. Most importantly, he made a rule. No matter how intense the filming day had been, he would spend the drive home consciously shedding Thomas Shelby's skin. By the time he reached his driveway, he would be Cillian Murphy again. Sarah noticed the difference immediately. "You're back," she said simply, and Cillian knew she meant more than just home from work. Peaky Blinders became a global phenomenon. Thomas Shelby entered the pantheon of iconic television characters alongside Tony Soprano, Walter White, and Don Draper. But unlike those characters, Thomas Shelby became something more than entertainment. He became a symbol of controlled power, of strategic thinking, of survival against impossible odds. Young men around the world began copying Thomas's haircut, his style, his mannerisms. Cillian watched this cultural impact with a mixture of pride and concern. "They don't understand," he confided to Sarah one evening. "They see the power and the confidence, but they don't see the cost. Thomas Shelby is a cautionary tale, not a role model." In 2019, during the filming of Season 5, Cillian received a letter that would change his perspective on his responsibility as an actor. It was from a young veteran named James, who had served in Afghanistan. "Mr. Murphy, I wanted to thank you for Thomas Shelby. Not because I want to be like him, but because he helped me understand myself. I came back from deployment with PTSD, feeling disconnected from everyone around me. Watching Thomas struggle with his own demons from WWI made me realize I wasn't broken, I was wounded, and wounds can heal. Thomas's journey from season 1 to now shows that trauma doesn't have to define you. You can carry the scars and still build something meaningful. You can protect what matters without losing your humanity. I started therapy because of what I saw in Thomas's relationship with his family. If a fictional character could find ways to love despite his damage, maybe I could too. Thank you for showing that strength isn't about being unbreakable. It's about continuing to function, even when you're falling apart. Respectfully, James Morrison. Cillian read the letter 3 times, each reading deepening his understanding of what he had accidentally created. Thomas Shelby wasn't just entertainment. He had become a mirror for people processing their own trauma, their own struggles with power and vulnerability. He wrote back immediately, "Dear James, your letter means more to me than any award or review ever could. You've helped me understand that Thomas Shelby's real power isn't in his intimidation or his strategic mind. It's in his refusal to surrender to his damage. If Thomas's story helped you seek healing, then every difficult day of filming, every moment of character bleed, every struggle with balancing his darkness and my light has been worth it. You are not broken. Neither is Thomas. Neither are any of us who carry invisible wounds. We are all just trying to build something meaningful from the pieces we have left. Thank you for reminding me why this work matters. With respect and admiration, Cillian Murphy." As Peaky Blinders progressed through its 6 seasons, Cillian's relationship with Thomas Shelby evolved from fear to understanding to something approaching wisdom. He learned to channel Thomas's intensity without being consumed by it, to access his darkness without losing his light. The techniques Brando had taught him, the 3 layers, the controlled explosions, the economy of gesture, became second nature. But more important, Cillian learned to use those techniques in service of emotional truth rather than mere intimidation. Critics began noting a depth in later seasons that went beyond the character's original conception. Thomas Shelby became not just a gangster, but a study in how trauma shapes leadership, how love manifests as protection, and how the past haunts the present in ways both destructive and redemptive. Cillian found something in Thomas that wasn't in the original scripts, Stephen Knight observed. He found the wounded healer, the reluctant prophet, the man who became what he hated in order to protect what he loved. The final season and beyond. When Peaky Blinders ended in 2022, Cillian faced another crisis, not of confidence this time, but of identity. After 9 years, Thomas Shelby had become so integrated into his consciousness that letting go felt like losing a limb. "Who am I without Thomas Shelby?" he asked Sarah on the night of the final wrap party. "You're the man who was brave enough to become him and wise enough to remain yourself," she replied. "You're the actor who took one of the biggest risks in television and turned it into one of the greatest performances of your generation." But the real test came with his next role, J. Robert Oppenheimer, in Christopher Nolan's biographical epic. It would require Cillian to transform completely once again, to find the same intensity he had brought to Thomas Shelby, but channeling it through an entirely different kind of character. The circle completes. On the night before filming began on Oppenheimer, Cillian sat in his study once more. Older now, more weathered, but infinitely more confident in his abilities. The same room where he had first met Brando's spirit, where he had first learned that courage could be cultivated. He didn't expect any supernatural visitors this time. He had internalized their lessons, made their wisdom part of his own consciousness. But as he prepared to tackle another seemingly impossible role, he felt their presence. Brando's revolutionary approach to character, Patrick's wisdom about surviving transformation, and Thomas Shelby's own hard-won knowledge about the cost and necessity of becoming more than you thought possible. Oppenheimer would require different techniques than Thomas Shelby, but the same fundamental courage, the courage to disappear completely into another human being's truth. As he opened the Oppenheimer script, Cillian smiled. He was no longer the terrified actor who had nearly turned down Peaky Blinders. He was a craftsman who had learned to fear nothing except dishonoring the characters entrusted to his care. The transformation that began with Thomas Shelby had taught him the most important lesson any actor can learn, that the only limits on what you can become are the ones you accept. Today, Cillian Murphy is recognized as one of the finest actors of his generation. His portrayal of Thomas Shelby influenced not just television drama, but popular culture itself. The character became a case study in universities, a symbol of complex masculinity, and proof that audiences hunger for characters who contain contradictions rather than simple archetypes. But for Cillian, the real legacy isn't in the awards or cultural impact. It's in the lesson that Marlon Brando's spirit taught him on that rainy Dublin night, that courage isn't the absence of fear, but the decision to do what needs to be done, despite the fear. Every time a young actor writes to him, paralyzed by a role that seems too big, too challenging, too important to risk, Cillian remembers his own terror at the prospect of playing Thomas Shelby. And he writes back with the same wisdom that was given to him. The fear you're feeling isn't proof that you're not ready. It's proof that the opportunity is real and important. If it weren't scary, it wouldn't be worth doing. Don't try to become the character. Let the character use you as a vessel to exist again. The difference is subtle, but it will change everything. And remember, every great actor in history felt exactly what you're feeling now. Marlon Brando had to audition for The Godfather at 47. If he could overcome fear, so can we. Fear is just the price of admission to greatness. The questions that matter. As Cillian's story demonstrates, transformation begins not with confidence, but with the courage to face our deepest fears about our own capabilities. His journey from terrified Irish actor to international icon teaches us several crucial lessons. First, that our greatest opportunities often come disguised as our greatest fears. The roles, projects, and challenges that terrify us are usually the ones with the power to transform us completely. Second, that mentorship comes in many forms. Sometimes it's a living teacher, sometimes it's the wisdom of those who came before us, and sometimes it's the voice of our own future selves calling us to become more than we thought possible. Third, that character, whether in acting or in life, isn't about eliminating our contradictions, but about embracing them. The most compelling people, fictional or real, are those who contain multitudes, who can be simultaneously strong and vulnerable, confident and uncertain, powerful and gentle. Finally, that transformation is always a choice. We can remain safely within our comfort zones, or we can risk everything to become the person we're capable of being. Cillian Murphy chose transformation. He chose to trust that he could become more than he was, that he could carry the weight of an iconic character without losing himself in the process. The question that remains is simple. What transformation are you avoiding? What role, literal or metaphorical, is waiting for you on the other side of your fear? Your Thomas Shelby is out there. The only question is whether you'll have the courage to say yes when he calls. Your transformation starts now. If this story resonated with you, if you recognized your own fears in Cillian Murphy's journey, then stop consuming inspiration and start applying it. Because here's the brutal truth nobody wants to admit. You can watch 1,000 motivational videos, read hundreds of inspiring biographies, but nothing changes until you have the courage to accept your next Thomas Shelby. You have 48 hours to do one thing. Identify one opportunity you're avoiding out of fear and take one concrete action toward it. You don't need to accept everything at once, but you need to take the first step. Send that email, make that call, sign up for that course, apply for that position, start that project. And you know why? Because in 10 years, you'll be in one of two places. Being the version of yourself who had the courage to try, or being the version who spent life wondering, what if? The choice is yours, but time waits for no one. Share this video with someone who needs to hear this message today. Someone who's in their own March 2013, holding their Peaky Blinders script, paralyzed by fear. Be the Marlon Brando in that person's life. Your greatness is waiting on the other side of your fear. The only question is, do you have enough courage to pursue it? What will you choose, safety or greatness, comfort or growth, fear or courage? Cillian Murphy chose courage. Marlon Brando chose courage. Thomas Shelby chose courage. Now it's your turn. Not tomorrow. Now.